this conversation is going to be really awesome, and we're very grateful to have it with you. And we'll talk all things kind of building employee referral programs and kind of your experiences. But I guess before we even get started, did you want to introduce yourself and kind of tell the people what you're doing and what you're up to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Ozzie. I am co-founder and head of engineering at Monarch Money. We are building a product that helps people manage their money and plan for their financial futures. Hiring has always been something I've been really passionate about. It's been the most critical part of pretty much every job I've had. And so prior to Monarch, I actually took a few months off and spent time writing a book on recruiting software engineers called the Holloway Guide to Technical Recruiting and Hiring. But along the way, I got to talk to a lot of really awesome hiring managers and recruiters and learned a ton from basically the best in the industry.
That is awesome. And where can people find your book? I know that was a small
It
plug.
is on, yeah, it is on Amazon. So you search for the Holloway Guide to Technical Recruiting and Hiring. It's also on holloway.com.
Okay, awesome. Well, that's really great. And I guess, to kind of start off on the subject of employee referral programs, can you kind of share some of the benefits of using an employee referral program, especially for early stage startups and when you're building?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is true both for early stage startups, but also at scale. But there are a lot of ways to find candidates and engage with them. Referrals have a bunch of benefits, but they're basically win-win-win in that, as you know, the thesis is like good people know good people, and smart, driven, talented people know other smart, driven, talented people. And so the company wins because you get to hire good people. The referrer who's referring other candidates wins because they get to help the company hire, and they get to work with people they like and have possibly worked with before. And the person who's referred hopefully wins as well because they get a new job that they're excited about. And so at small companies, that's like often the first and most viable channel to find candidates. Like you don't have a brand, you may not have a recruiting team. All you kind of have is like, maybe a product, maybe not yet. You have a vision for the future, and you have a network of people you and your team know and have worked with before. So that's usually where people start, is just tapping into that network before they can get big enough to start investing in other more channels that might work more at scale. But I've seen one hiring manager I talked to was able to hire 100-person engineering team almost exclusively using their network and the network of the people they hired. I've seen that for a lot of companies that tends to like tap out a little earlier. Maybe you get to like 10 to 20 people before you start having to supplant your hiring strategy with other channels. And of course, there's also a diversity element to it as well, where if you're only relying on your network and not adding an extra lens to that, it might be that like you're just going to hire a lot of people who are like you or like your early team, and then that gets harder to fix at scale. So sometimes even companies where referrals are working really well will either try to add that lens to the referral process, or will start introducing other channels as well, just to avoid the homogeneity that might result if you're relying solely on that.
Yeah, I kind of want to go dive a little bit deeper into the diversity aspect of it. Are you familiar with the term diversity debt? Um,
Yeah,
can,
absolutely.
can you talk a little bit more about that, especially keeping it in mind at the earliest stage, but I guess just in general when company building?
Yeah, so I think the term probably, well, it's kind of analogy to any debt you would incur, which is something you can rack up, but then eventually will have to pay down over time. And so, for people who are technical or engineers, then a similar term might be technical debt. And so diversity debt is similar in that if it's not something you're thinking about early on, then as your company grows, it gets harder to change. So for instance, let's say you're hiring, you get to a 20-person team and it's all men, right? Well, then as you start trying to hire people who don't, identify as men, are going to look at the team and might have hesitations about joining the company. And then that's kind of a thing you'd have to overcome, because they'll be wondering, like, well, is this a company that is a good place for me to go if no one else who, if the team is so homogenous at that stage. And gender is just one dimension. There are many others where that would be the case. But as a company grows, it gets harder and harder to then pay down that debt or correct it. And so a lot of hiring managers are kind of stuck between, like, well, I want to hire and grow as fast as possible. And so the easiest thing to do is just like hire the first people I can find. But we the tech industry does have systemic diversity issues. And so if that's all you do, then it's just going to get harder to change when your company is larger. And so there's a balancing act in there.
Absolutely. And kind of keeping that balance in mind when looking for people to refer to your company, would you say it's better to leverage first degree connections or maybe even second degree ones? Like, what is the best way to kind of avoid that diversity debt, but also keeping in mind that you're a small company trying to build and might not have the tools or resources to source, if not using the swarm?
Yeah. I think it's so. I mean, I'll give the disclaimer that I'm not a diversity expert, and there are people in the industry who've done a lot of research on this and can probably speak to this much better than I can. I think whether it's first or second degree connections, like at the end of the day, that there are certain, again, I'll use the gender example because it's the easiest one, but like the software industry is predominantly male, and the sad part is, if you kind of go back through, like, people talk about, is it a pipeline problem or not a pipeline problem, like as you get deeper into the pipeline, whether you start from like school to college to like entry level software positions deeper, at each of those stages there's drop off in gender. But I think at the end of the day, so there is a systemic problem in the industry that the industry has not been able to solve. And so whether you're looking at first degree connections or second degree connections, there's probably going to be a risk there. And so it's good to have some lens that you put on top of any, your entire recruiting pipeline, all channels, not just referrals, to make sure that like the mix of candidates you're engaging with and how you assess those candidates helps rather than hurts the diversity problem.
Makes sense. And so, kind of taking a step back, how would one go about even building an employee referral program as a founder of an early stage startup?
So I will tell you how not to do it, because this is usually where people start.
All right.
I think what a lot of people do is they just, they look at what big tech companies are doing, and they see that, Google or Facebook or whoever offers like whatever $5,000 if someone working at that company refers someone who ends up joining. And so people think they can just, set up a program like that and say, maybe they pay less than the FANGs for referrals, whatever, add some money, tell their team, and then, now they have a referral program. And that just doesn't work. I think there's a lot more you have to do to get the referral pump flowing, so to speak. One obvious one, which is kind of like still worth saying, is that if your company is not a great place to work, if the people who work there are not like excited about their work and proud of it, then no matter what you do, they're just not going to tell people to join. And so it sounds obvious, but like it's just so important, because at the end of the day, like if I refer someone to my company, I'm kind of on the line, right? And so if I'm not happy at my job, why would I refer anyone, even if there's a little bit of money in it? In fact, like the money might even make it worse. So that's kind of a second lesson I've seen sometimes is people, and this might go back to like behavioral theory, but a lot of times people will refer their friends or former colleagues, classmates organically, right? Again, because it's a win-win-win. And then you put money on it, and that like crowds out the intrinsic motivation. So people are now like, well, I want to refer my friend, but I don't want to look like I'm doing it for the money, because that's not really why I'm doing it. And I don't want to like bombard my like manager or the hiring manager. And so I'm just not going to refer people. And so that money aspect can sometimes be detrimental, and using it as kind of a signal that, this is something we value and we encourage is great, but just making the entire thing about the money can actually be detrimental. Like I've seen companies where the referral flow has decreased as soon as they put a reward And they made that like that policy official. A few other things that I found help a ton. One is adding some structure around it. So you think about there's usually a lot of stuff going around in like people's brains, and like so remembering the like really talented person you were in college with, who's in your class, or you worked with at your last job, may not like that person may not be top of mind. You may not have talked to them recently. And so putting some structure, like what a lot of companies will do to put structure around it could be, when someone joins, like a month after they join, there's a meeting with, either a founder or co-founder if the company's small, or a recruiter if they're a little further along. And that meeting is purely to like generate referrals, right? And some people are not that you have to do this, some people are very structured about it. They'll like go through the person's history, be like, okay, at college, like in your algo class, in your algorithms class, who is like the person that like you looked up to the most, or at your last job, who is like, the best salesperson. And those really targeted prompts help people generate that like recall in their memory that they otherwise may not like, if you're just passive about it, they may not remember. And then the last piece, I guess, just giving really good, like running a really good recruiting process. And that includes both for the person being referred and the referrer. So I always encourage people to give updates to the referrer on how the candidate is doing. Like, hey, Vanessa, I just talked to Max and he was awesome. Thanks so much for referring him. Just so you know, the next step is like, we're going to do a coding interview or something like that. And so that gives feedback to people on the team, because the referrals aren't just like getting, dropped into the abyss. They're like, they can see, they have visibility. And in fact, they might even, like if you get to offer stage, they're engaged enough, they'll like help, sell the candidate. And same thing for the candidate themselves. Like if I refer someone and then they have a bad recruiting experience, like, the company ghosts them or something, I'm just not going to refer people again, because then it like makes me look bad. So having, great sort of process or service for both the person being referred and the person doing the refer can, over the long run, helps a ton as well.
And what would you recommend founders include in this kind of structured employee referral program policy, just overall kind of evergreen in that sense?
Yeah, I think a like financial reward is great. If used accordingly, then like not being, the focus of the program. Regular updates to the person who referred the candidate. And then call outs if someone is hired through this program, right? At like the company all hands of like, hey, we just, we hired Max and it was Vanessa who referred him. Thanks, Vanessa, for doing that. Kind of helps close the loop and like bring it home, and then, prompt other people to engage with the program as well.
Okay. And what are like typical rewards or incentives that you see work well, this, like taking it away from the FANG lens of, giving thousands of dollars or vacations and things like that? I'd be curious to know.
Yeah, I mean, money's obviously one thing. Sometimes it's gifts and like badges that you can like accumulate over time. I've heard, but I haven't seen this firsthand, that like there might be equity boosts for those sorts of things. But I'd say it's probably less typical.
That makes sense. And I guess to kind of look at the other side of it, what are some typical stumbling blocks of when building an employee referral program, and how can you kind of remove those early on?
Yeah, I think it goes back to some of the points I talked about, of just like making sure that, your company is a great place to work, your existing employees are happy, that you take as much friction out of the process as possible. So giving people some structure and some prompts, making sure it's not just about some financial reward, and then running a really good recruiting process. I think if, all those things come together, things will probably work pretty well for the referral program.
That makes sense. Thinking back to one of my previous companies, because I was in the recruiting organization, I actually was not allowed to participate in the employee referral program. I guess this is a kind of a twofold question. Have you seen that happen? And in your opinion, which employees should be able to participate in a program or not participate by your estimation?
Yeah, I think it's typical for people where it's like expected as part of your job that you are contributing to the hiring process would be excluded. So that would typically encompass recruiters and hiring managers, though as companies grow, a lot of times that exclusion will only apply for roles that are in your domain, right? So if I am a hiring manager on the engineering team and I refer someone on the sales side who ends up getting hired, then I might be eligible for the program. Whereas if I refer an engineer that I then hire, like, clearly there's some conflict of interest there. And the same thing applies for recruiters. If it's like, roles that they're working on or expected to be working on, it probably wouldn't make a lot of sense. So companies will typically exclude hiring managers and recruiters from those rewards, especially if it's for a role that the hiring manager / recruiter is working on hiring for.
Makes sense. And so do you think recruiters should take maybe a more white glove approach when dealing with referrals? Or should they kind of treat it like every other candidate in the pipeline? How do you kind of gauge that? I've seen kind of both sides of the coin before.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say like yes and no. Like in theory, all your candidates should be getting some sort of white glove treatment. In practice, that's not what always happens, right? Like sometimes, communication may not go super well, and you try to minimize those cases. But, if you had to choose where you're dropping the ball, you probably wouldn't want to drop the ball on candidates who are referred. So I'd say they deserve like extra attention. But in general, they should get the white glove treatment, but so should anyone else who expresses interest in your company. But sometimes there's just practical considerations, right? Like there might be too many people applying, and there's ways to mitigate that and make sure anyone who applies gets some response, or set expectations that not everyone but in general, no one who wants to work at your company should have a bad experience, because that just has, well, it's not a nice thing to do, but it also has a lot of like downstream ramifications. Because companies, when we talk about referrals, we're usually talking about existing employees referring candidates. But a lot of times it's candidates who refer other candidates. And even if you don't have a formal program for that, well, I've seen some companies that do set that up. I'd say it's a little more rare. It does happen. It's like any product. There's always word of mouth and people telling other people like, oh, I interviewed at this company, but either I didn't get an offer or I got the offer and I turned it down. But like, it's awesome. You would love it there. You should probably apply. Or the inverse of that, like I interviewed there and then the recruiter ghosted me, or the hiring manager like was, not pleasant to talk to, or whatever the situation is. And then that like deters other people from applying in the future.
Awesome. And what are one of the ways that you've seen making it easy for employees to streamline the referral process? Is it simply just walking up to their hiring manager, or to their manager, and being like, hey, John Smith is a really good candidate? Or is there a more kind of uniformed way to do it?
Yeah. I think it's good to have some space for it to happen organically. And that's also like something where people might be shy about referring candidates if they're not fully sure if the candidate is a fit, because they're worried that they're going to be wasting a hiring manager or recruiter's time. And so I usually just try to tell my team that like, it doesn't, like, even if you have some doubt about it, like, you're not wasting my time. Like, this is a big part of what's going to make our company successful, is finding the right people. So just send people through the program, like send them to me, send them to the recruiter we're working with, and we will decide whether, there's a fit, or we'll talk to them and mutually like decide whether there's a fit. But you're not, you have to set expectation that they're not wasting your time. So just to reduce that friction as much as possible, but having some structure around it where, there is like a meeting with some cadence after someone joins, or on some regular basis, where the purpose of the meeting is to prompt for those referrals, can help a ton as well. So you kind of want a balance of both the like prompted, structured channels, but also just having, the organic ad hoc submissions happen as well.
That makes sense. And when should employees be paid for their referrals? Should it be as soon as the person signs the offer? Should it be, maybe the first quarter afterwards, first year? I've seen many different answers, so I'm curious.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a strong opinion there. I've usually defaulted to like a few weeks or like a month after the person joins. I think, offer accept seems a little bit early to me. Not everyone who accepts an offer ends up joining, and it's rare for someone to back out, but it does happen. And at the same time, the inverse of that I think is like the longer you wait, then the longer the feedback loop is. And ideally, if I refer someone and they join, I shouldn't have to wait a full quarter to get rewarded for that. So the faster it is, the better. But I think waiting till the person starts is like a reasonable thing to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've seen it, the system of waiting 3 months, and people just get a little bit frustrated. Like sometimes they'll refer their backfill and it's like, well, wait, like, how does that work? So I guess it's either or. So
Yeah. And that's a good point too. I think it also communicates some lack of like trust of like, well, are you expecting me to refer someone who's gonna like quit after like 30 days? Like that's not what I'm trying to do here.
that makes sense. And so, from my estimation, from what you've said, I think founders should be thinking about this, pretty much ASAP. But would you say otherwise? Maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be formal, but some sort of,
Yeah. I
program.
think there's a question of in there of like when do you formalize it and start putting like numbers around the financial reward and stuff. But like, having referrals as a candidate stream, I think is a non-negotiable like thing that every startup should have. Like you just can't, like, a startup's hiring is hard and finding good people is hard. And so we can't afford to like not have that as a channel. And it might have some downsides like diversity and such, but those can all be mitigated.
Yeah, that makes sense. That debt that you don't want to necessarily pay, but maybe it could be paid off at the end of the day.
Mm.
Well, those are my questions. Anything for me? I know you said you had a plethora of notes. I'd love to kind of go through that. I know
I will have to say your questions were on point because we covered pretty much everything in there.
Okay, cool. Well, that's amazing. I guess that concludes our interview for now. Any other questions or comments or thoughts before we wrap things up?
No, I hope this is useful for people and really appreciate getting to be a part of this.
Absolutely. And I appreciate the time, and we'll talk soon. Thank you so
All right.
much.
Thanks so much.